As soon as the disciples return from mission, Jesus wants to take them to a deserted place, an eremos topos, which is the wilderness. And obviously, the reason is for rest and aloneness. They have worked, they have done all that is required. Now they need to be a little rested, both physically and spiritually. Now, many of us also do this once a year, once every 6 months or whatever. We get involved in the ministry in such a manner that sometimes there is no rest, there's no physical rest, there is no contact with God and so on. And we need that. So the disciples need that, and Jesus takes it. However, they cannot rest, because as soon as they step ashore to the place where they want to go, they see a great crowd. And the response of Jesus to this is not so much agitation, like, you made your plans and now those plans are going awry. We had thought we would rest. This is, I think, an important point also to realize. So the plans have been made. And what are the plans for? The plans are for a physical rest. The plans are for a spiritual rest. And those plans are gone awry. That means we cannot really do that. We cannot go, we cannot work according to plan. And yet, notice, the response of Jesus is compassion rather than agitation. And how is it that Jesus is able to respond in this manner? Because what he instructed his disciple, he himself is doing, namely, that he will be detached from the outcome. This is such an important concept to keep in mind if you are to enjoy peace of mind and not give in to agitation, and then challenges like high blood pressure and hypertension and so on. And so Jesus comes on the shore, and what would have been rest now becomes work once again. And notice, this compassion which is shown, Mark gives us how to interpret that compassion and why Jesus has compassion, because they seem lost. When he uses this term of sheep without a shepherd, he's telling us they seem lost, because sheep without a shepherd have got no sense of direction whatever. And that is why the first thing which Jesus does, he directs them, he teaches them, he explains things to them. And then, after hearing, and possibly the teaching would have gone on for some time, the disciples come to Jesus with a request to send the crowds away. So the disciples, in a certain sense, are acting logically here, because it makes sense. We need to be alone. You have brought us here to be alone by ourselves. So unless they go, we cannot be alone. However, as far as Jesus is concerned, now we need to move to plan B. Modern management experts talk about plan A, plan B, plan C. That means you must avoid putting all your eggs in one basket. When you make a plan, you make a budget, have another alternative, so that in case, for some reason, the first one cannot be put into action, you got a second one, and you got a third, and you are not caught unawares. So plan B now, his first plan is to be rested. Now Jesus moves into plan B. So the response of Jesus is to put the onus on the disciples. And even though on the surface level, it might seem like the disciples are asking a question, on the deeper level, they are being sarcastic. That is, they already put a block to the miracle. They put a block to the miracle, saying, first of all, is it possible for any shop in this place to have enough bread to feed these people. First point. Second, let us assume that there is a shop and it has enough bread. Where would we get 200 denarii, 6 months' wages? Where would we get that money? So to be sure that 200 denarii would buy the loaves required to at least have a half day's ration. But where is the money? We don't have so much of money. So they express incredulity, they express sarcasm, they put a dampener, they put a stop. Now this is what each of us needs to watch for. While it is true, we need to be realistic, it is also true, we do not need to be pessimistic. The disciples are in a sense realistic when they come to Jesus to say, send the crowds away. But they are being pessimistic when Jesus puts the onus on them. Now this, all of us need to watch for. You can be a realist, but you can also be an optimist. And you can be a realist, but you can be a pessimist. The response of Jesus is not to their question, but to invite them to look within. The invitation is to look within. Do not put stoppers already before you can begin. Do not say, I cannot, before you try. So go and check. And they go, and the crowd are seated. Now notice, it is not simply seated as it is written in English. The crowd are reclining, and you only reclined at a festival, at a feast. That's why in the Last Supper, they are reclining. You're not just sitting down. They are surely reclining. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50, where Jesus is invited for a meal in the house of Simon the Pharisee, he is reclining. That's why his feet are behind him. So he's sitting on his hand is resting on a couch and his feet are behind him, reclining, enjoying, relaxing, you might say. So the crowds are not merely seated here. Jesus tells them to get them to recline. The groups mentioned here is a symposium. It's a drinking party. So it indicates a kind of bond. So not simply feeding as you would just feed people. Now this is important for us today. That there are so many people in this pandemic who are without food. Many do not even eat once a day. And these groups are basically ordered groups, and yet the meal is a festive meal very clearly. Jesus, of course, because he is unusual and different, looks up to heaven. Usually, a person would look down. The point seems to be that for Jesus, God must always be the focus. Our founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola, had this tradition in Jesuit houses, which many other houses also have, many other congregations also have, which was called reading at table. That is, one Jesuit would be chosen to read at table while others were having lunch. And one of the reasons, besides many others, one of the reasons was to realize that the food is not the end. The food is for nourishment. So don't focus so much on the food that you lose sense of everything else. Enjoy the food, eat it well, but it is ultimately something which must nourish you. You are also being nourished by the word that you are hearing. As a matter of fact, in overcoming the first temptation, Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, Luke chapter 4, verses 1 to 13, Jesus says it so clearly there. A human being does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. So by looking up, Jesus is saying, God is the focus, and God must be the focus and not the food. So the bread is broken and divided. And so the fish. The fish is divided, maybe not broken. And the confirmation of the miracle is that it was a miracle, is that all ate and were filled. The leftover are 12 baskets. And this word for baskets, which Mark uses here, namely kophinos, is usually regarded as the Jewish basket. And that is why this feeding is regarded as a Jewish feeding. In 2 Kings, Elisha also has a feeding miracle. But there, only 100 men are fed, and with 20 loaves. So 1 loaf is shared, you might say, between 5 men, which is understandable and need not really be seen as a miracle. And then we are given the number, which of course Matthew will exaggerate when he says 5,000 men, not counting women and children. Matthew likes to exaggerate what he finds in Mark. But here, 5,000 is the number found everywhere. And the only miracle which Jesus worked that is found in all the 4 Gospels, is this one, feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, in which 12 baskets are gathered. Though other details might differ, these 4 facts are in all the 4: 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 are fed, and 12 baskets are gathered. There are a variety of interpretations of what may have happened. I will give you a few of them. One interpretation is that Jesus was very friendly with the Essene community. The Essene community would store their food in holes in the ground in the desert. So because Jesus was friendly with them, he knew where this food was. There was this secret stash of food which would be stored in holes in the ground. And he was standing over and above one of them and taking out these loaves and giving it. So the crowd was fooled into thinking something mysterious and miraculous had happened. Rich and pious ladies, and Luke gives us this in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Luke speaks very specifically about women disciples who provided for Jesus out of their means. So rich and pious ladies used to inquire, where is Jesus preaching now? And send baskets of food, including fish. Others have said that this is a miracle which shows the personality, which shows the charisma of Jesus, that he could get people to share what they had, their own provisions. So it became like a party to which we are invited, and each one of us is asked to bring a small dish which we have either cooked or bought. And we come to the party and place it in common, and everybody shares from that. And often our experience is that there is much more than is required when such actions are done. And so Jesus shared his own food, and people saw how selfless Jesus was, and they followed suit. They became generous as well. Some say the numbers are exaggerating. They may not have been 5,000, they may have been about 500. And they may have had about 50 loaves, so the numbers are exaggerated. Others say it was a sacramental meal where basically, like in the Eucharist, We each receive the whole body of Christ, even though physically we receive what might seem to others only a small host. So it was more a sacramental meal rather than a physical meal. This incident, some say, also emphasizes the need to combine teaching with social concern, and this is so important in the present pandemic. Jesus always and everywhere in the gospel shows, and we must follow suit here, that the kingdom which he came to proclaim is not merely a spiritual enterprise, but it is very practical. In other words, we cannot merely preach to people that they must be filled, they must be warm. We also, when necessary, like Jesus, provide the bread. So we feed the heart of the people, but we also feed their bodies. This, what follows, Mark 6:45-52, often termed as walking on the water, is more a theophany than a miracle, as we shall see in the manner in which Mark narrates it. Once again, for the second time in the Gospel of Mark, we are shown that Jesus, after this miracle, and John gives us a possible reason, though Mark does not say that, John gives us the possible reason that Jesus went up to the mountain to pray. And what John says, they wanted to make him king. When they experienced that feeling, they wanted to make him king. So possibly, his dismissal of the crowd would have been a big challenge, because people would have wanted to clamor and to keep being with him. However, Jesus went up to the mountain to pray. This is the second time in the Gospel of Mark where we are shown Jesus praying. Jesus is shown praying in Mark 3 times. This is the second time. The first time we noticed was after his popularity in 135. People are asking, people are clamoring, people want to be with him. Here, for the second time, he goes to pray. And then Mark tells us that in the evening, the disciples are straining. He saw that they were straining. This is when Jesus goes to them. This phrase, early in the morning, must be interpreted, is actually in the Greek text around the 4th watch of the night. Mark goes by the Roman reckoning. The Romans divided the day into two periods of 12 hours each. And each of those 12-hour periods had 4 watches of 3 hours each. So the 4th watch, when Mark tells us the 4th watch is from 3 to 6 a.m. At that time, a person is at his or her lowest degree of attention. A person's eyes are closing. The body is giving way. So by Mark telling us early in the morning and telling us it was the 4th watch of the night, he's indicating that the Lord comes to them at their weakest. He comes walking on the sea, that is where they are straining to move ahead, to aid them in their struggle. In the Old Testament, only God, Job 9:8, only God can walk on waters. Human beings cannot walk on water. So walking on the sea is therefore a theophany. That by walking on the sea, Jesus shows that he is Son of God. Meaning to pass them by, paralkein autus, meaning to pass them by, as God passes by Elijah in 1 Kings 19. God asks Elijah, stand at the entrance of the cave, and God passes by Elijah in a moment of self-revelation. And the identification of Jesus when he says, I So these are basically the interpretations which are given. Some say that Jesus walked on submerged stones. I think that is to miss the point. The point is not so much walking on submerged stones or walking on mud flats as some interpret. The background, as we saw, Job 9:8. Only God can walk on waters. Job 9:11. Look, he passes by me. The disciples think it is a ghost. However, Jesus responds by telling them, Tharsaete me phobieste ego emi. Tharsaete means take heart or courage. Me phobieste, do not be afraid. It's the imperative tense. Both tharsaete, as you can see, and me phobieste are both in the imperative tense. That means he's giving them a command. Courage, do not be afraid, do not fear. Ego emi, I am. So the revelation, and that's why I call this a theophany, which is done in three ways. The first is by Jesus walking on the water. Only God walks on water. Jesus meant to pass them by in a moment of self-revelation and the revelation of himself as God, the same terms which God uses in Exodus 3:14 indicates that this must be read as a theophany. This is a miracle which is present in three Gospels, and in all the Gospels, it is immediately after the feeding miracle. That is Mark, Matthew, and John. Luke does not have this miracle in his Gospel. So Jesus enters the boat. Once again, the wind ceases like it ceased when he commanded the wind in Mark 4:35-41. The amazement of the disciples results in making the story a miracle story. However, Mark does not really mean it primarily as a miracle story. He means it more as a theophany. And then Mark makes a very, very strong statement when he tells us that the disciples did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This statement, which Mark makes, is such a strong statement. They did not understand about the loaves, reveals their failure to understand the main event. They interpret this incident as a miracle. So Jesus is showing his power. No, Jesus is revealing himself to them as I am. The amazement which they have does not allow them to be open. They are only taken up. They are impressed. They are not inspired. So you can be impressed with the work that somebody is doing. It's so fantastic, but you will not be inspired. Now, what is important is that our work and the work that we do inspires people. So people are impressed with you that you are so efficient, but are you also efficacious? To be efficient is required, but I believe that is the primary requirement. More than being efficient, we need to be efficacious, and this is our call as disciples of Jesus. So Mark, when he makes this statement, they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened, is telling us that the disciples are now on the level of outsiders who see but do not perceive, who hear but do not understand. And then in these verses, Mark gives us a sort of summary of what Jesus is doing. Somebody asked me about the geography of Mark. Anyone with a little knowledge of geography will know that they cannot land at Gennesaret from where they were. And that's why some explain this, that the wind from the northeast blew the boat southeast in the direction of Gennesaret, where Jesus and his disciples then put ashore. So this is the absurd explanation which some give, to show the landing at Gennesaret. My explanation is that Mark is not focusing on geography so much, but he's focusing on the place. He's focusing on the content. So we should not get so caught up, and that is why I did not get caught up, because you can keep criticizing Mark's geography, but it will lead you nowhere. Here is one example of what it means to criticize Mark's geography. But those who want to make sense of Mark's geography will say that Mark's geography is correct because the wind which was bad, and Mark doesn't say anything about it. But they interpret the battering wind from the northeast blew the boat southeast in the direction of Gennesaret, and that's why Jesus and his disciples landed at Gennesaret. You could interpret it in that manner, but like I said, it leads us nowhere. Mark's focus was not so much the geography as it was the theology, and that's what we need to focus on. So Jesus, when he comes to show, is recognized by people. There is no teaching here. In 6b, Jesus began to teach. There is no dialogue with the sick. There is no action on the part of Jesus. The activity goes on around Jesus. That is, the sick are healed. And what is more important is, just like in the case of the woman with the flow of blood, who had that monologue with herself in which she said that she would be healed, she had faith. This is something similar to that, where the people's action is stressed. They are the ones who take the initiative. They are the ones who reach out and touch Jesus and are healed. In chapter 7, we encounter the challenge between what is known as unclean and clean, and later in chapter 7 itself, but verses 14 to 23, the inside and the outside. Now what we notice is this, that we are in the Galilee section. If you remember, I said to you that in the Galilee section, there is no objection, there is acceptance. The only objection, if there is, come from his townspeople and come from his family. Mark has made this very explicit here. Notice the Pharisees and some of the scribes in the Galilee section who had come from Jerusalem. So by mentioning that they had come from Jerusalem, Mark once again is making clear that there is no challenge in the Galilee section except from his family and from those who come from Jerusalem. We remember earlier on that even in chapter 3, verse 22, when Jesus was accused of casting out demons by the prince of demons, Beelzebul, then also the scribes had come from Jerusalem. The behavior of the disciples is questioned. We saw earlier on how these scribes also questioned not Jesus, but the behavior. The word defiled hands is basically not hands which were unclean, but hands which were unwashed. So the disciples do not wash their hands before eating. It's likely that they may have washed them without being seen, or they may have washed them sometime earlier and did not feel the need to wash them. However, this is a very clear example of how the ritual takes precedence over the actuality. So ritual purification rather than hygienic washing. So the focus is, no, if my hands are clean, if I'm hygienic, then I don't need to follow the ritual. This is how the disciples were possibly taught by Jesus to interpret the ritual. And then Mark gives us an explanation, possibly because he is writing for a largely Gentile community who will not understand what the meaning of this ritual meant. If you wash your hands should be dirty. I can understand if you wash. But what does it mean that you wash your hands ritually before you're having your meal? The Pharisees' question here is not hostile. However, it is linked with the tradition of the elders. If Jesus has subsumed the law to human beings, you can imagine how much more he will subsume the tradition of the elders to human beings. The response of Jesus is to quote scripture, not the tradition. And in Isaiah, the worship of the people is lip service and not heart service. This is something which we need to watch for, which we need to keep in mind. If worship is merely external, if it does not come from the heart, it does not seem to be true worship at all. This brings me to something which we need to watch for in our lives as seminarians, in our lives as religious. We may sometimes follow the rule and the regulation blindly. The rule and regulation says we must arise at 6 o'clock in the morning, so we are awake at 6 in the morning. However, because we have not followed the rule, which also said we should go to bed at 10 o'clock, but were awake till 1 and 2 in the morning, whatever we were doing, when we get up at 6 because the bell has rung and because we need to be in the chapel at 6:30, we will be sleepy in the chapel since we have not had the sleep our body requires. And then we are physically in the chapel. We are meant to be praying at that time, but because the body is still not recovered from the night, we are asleep in the chapel. Now, we are externally following the rule, but the worship is not really there. We are not praying, we are not sleeping, we are not doing any of these things. So we are sleeping in the chapel. And so therefore, whatever we do has to come from within. If it comes from only the external, then this is what happens. The law is given second place and the human traditions are given first place. That means we get so nervous of our superiors, of those who are watching us, of those who are making a note of us. We get so nervous of them that we do it only to be seen by them. So the real true law of love is given second place. And Jesus explains how this is done by giving tradition as an excuse. The fifth commandment says, you must honor your father and your mother, both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. However, to circumvent the commandment, one brings in tradition, and the tradition here of Qurban. Qurban is only an example of how tradition usurps the commandment. What does Qurban mean? Qurban means, I offer this home of mine to God. When I offer this home of mine to God, I cannot use it for anything else. I cannot use it to put my mommy and daddy in my home. I say, no, this place is God's place, but the place is vacant. The place is so beautiful. Your mom and dad could stay in that place. No, it is given to God. And then when I push my mom and dad out, I use it as I want. So what I do is I circumvent the law. I go around the law, and the word of God is given second place. The word of God is abandoned. It is rejected. And finally, notice the word of God is made void. So this is what I do. And I justify what I'm doing by talking about tradition and the tradition of the elders. In verse 16, deliberately, I've highlighted this because Jesus is very clear that people with ears have to hear. Now, I've highlighted this because some texts do not have it. If you go to the new RSV, it does not, but I would like to believe that this has been part of the original text because this is what Jesus is saying is something important and people have to respond to it. So now in the second part of chapter 7, Jesus addresses the crowd. So he has dealt with the question of law and human tradition by showing how the law is circumvented and tradition is given importance. Now he addresses the crowds. So listen and understand. Already there, again in verse 16, there is a summons to listen and understand. In the new RSV, because verse 16 has not been part of the original text, I have mentioned it in the earlier slide, but do not speak about it here. The saying seems to refer to the defiled hands, which he's talking about in verse 15. This was later applied to food, where Mark wants to show that Jesus declared all foods clean. In verse 17, when Jesus enters the house, he instructs his disciples privately, and the reason Mark shows Jesus as entering the house is in order to give private instructions to his disciples. Even though the word parable here is not in the regular sense in which parable is understood, that is a fictitious but true to life story which draws the listener, here the word parable is what his own response is about circumventing the law and about giving human traditions importance. There is nothing which goes into a person from outside. So while the origin of that is the eating with defiled hands or unclean hands, physically not following the ritual, now it is extended later on to food. Nothing from outside. And I would extend it even further, not merely to food, but to anything and everything. What do I mean by this? I mean, one cannot blame the external situation, the external person, the external thing for the manner in which one responds. There is nothing from outside which comes into me and defiles me or makes me unclean. There is nothing from outside which must make me react and blame it. Why are you depressed? The pandemic of COVID-19. No, that cannot be a reason. COVID-19 is being faced by everybody, but there are just a small percentage of people who are depressed. So you cannot blame COVID-19 for your depression. So it is not something outside of me which depresses me. What depresses me is my response. How do I respond? I can decide to respond positively to COVID-19. I can reach out to people who need help because of COVID-19, and I will have no time to give in to depression. And so therefore, Jesus is very clear, even though Mark restricts it and tells us that he declared all foods clean. It seems to me Jesus is being very broad when he tells us, do not blame someone for your action. Children might be allowed to blame someone for their actions, but you and I as adults have to accept responsibility. And then he tells the disciples, is it not clear that you have not really grown up? You need to grow up. He gives the reason, because when you respond, it is your response rather than the stimulus which creates the problem. And so therefore nothing from outside can make you unclean, but what comes out. So your frustration, your anxiety, your fear, your anger comes from outside. And 13 vices are mentioned, and evil intentions is, you might say, the broad idea. The following 12 are in two groups of 6. The first are specific acts and vices later on in the abstract. So the all of what comes from within us and what comes out comes from within, because it is I who respond in such a manner. And so therefore this is like a summary of the whole discourse. If a person is clean within, then the person is clean without. If something is within me, it will come out and it will be seen. The next scene to show already that Jesus is not restricted in his mission only to the Jews, and that will be confirmed even in the second feeding miracle. is the healing of the Syrophoenician woman. So Tyre is often linked with Sidon. It was a Gentile area, and Jesus enters the house. The Matthean Jesus, notice, in the same text, which is found in Matthew 15, 21 to 28. Matthew calls her a Canaanite woman, but a very similar text. Matthew's Jesus will not enter a house, because in Matthew, Jesus never enters a Gentile's house. As a matter of fact, you might remember, the healing of the centurion's servant is done from a distance. Jesus does not go to the centurion's house because the centurion is a Gentile. And that's why Jesus never enters a Gentile's house. Mark's Jesus will have no problem. Jesus enters a house, but he does not want to be known. And as we have seen earlier on, when he tries to escape with his disciples to a private place, he could not escape notice. So the people are keeping on coming to him, and people keep on coming for him. So the woman comes to him. And notice, like Jairus earlier, we saw Jairus, the second person in the Gospel of Mark, to fall at his feet. Like Jairus, whose daughter is at the point of death. This woman places herself at the mercy of Jesus. The woman was Greek, that is a Gentile, and she was a Syrophoenician by birth. So she was both from a different area, from the area of Phoenicia, the Syria and Phoenicia, the combination of Syria and Phoenicia. She begs Jesus to cast out the demon. Now, she possibly had heard of Jesus, was aware of his power, and she knows that he can do it. Notice, unlike in Matthew's Gospel, where in the beginning he does not utter her a word. And Matthew can have that, can have the disciples with him because he's outside. Mark doesn't mention disciples because Jesus is in a house. The Matthean Jesus is very, very, very parochial, exclusive, narrow when he says, it is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He does not have, like Mark has, let the children be fed first. When Jesus says in Mark, let the children be fed first, he's leaving it open to the dogs to eat afterwards. The dogs can eat second. The dogs can eat later. But now the children must eat. The Matthean Jesus, Matthew 15, 21 to 58, leaves no scope for the dogs to eat. So in Mark, when Jesus speaks, the children's claim is first, yes, but not only, not exclusive. And even though some interpret dogs as house dogs, which is okay, it cannot be denied. It cannot be denied that this is a serious insult. However, it was an insult which was accepted because the Jews would treat everyone else as dogs. Only they were the chosen people. The woman is very, very up to the task. She accepts the division, even accepts this terrible title, this terrible label. And she speaks about the fact that the dogs are eating under the table. And notice, they're not eating second. They're eating at the same time. The same time. They're not eating second. They're not eating afterwards. They are eating even as the children are eating. That is important to keep in mind. The woman addresses as Jesus as Kurios, Lord, which is used only here by Mark. And possibly, like Mark does elsewhere, he shows that those who really recognize Jesus are people whom you would never expect to recognize him, like blind Bartimaeus later on. like the leper in the beginning, and those who are meant to recognize him, like the religious authorities and the disciples, fail to do that. In Matthew, the woman is granted what she asks for because of her faith. But in Mark, Jesus accepts that she has beaten him in the argument. Notice, for saying that. You're saying that I've lost the argument. So Jesus is so magnanimous, is so broad in Mark, that he can accept he has been beaten by a woman in the argument for saying that. Matthew, of course, will not allow anyone to win an argument with Jesus. Woman, great is your faith. He changes what Mark has. For saying that, that means we have won the argument. And he doesn't even mention faith here. Jesus of Mark does not even mention faith. And the fact that the woman has got what she wanted is that a daughter is lying on the bed and the demon is gone. And so very clearly, as far as this miracle is concerned, we can see the comparison in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark. The Matthean Jesus will say, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Let the children be fed first. What Mark will say, the Mark in Jesus, for it is not fair to take the children's food. But the children will be fed first, dogs can eat later. The woman, of course, responds in a similar manner. Yes, Lord. In Matthew's Gospel, the term Lord is special because only believers address Jesus as Lord, not so in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark's Gospel, the word sir, which is kurios, is actually Lord. Even the dogs under the table, notice, eat the children's crumbs. In Mark, it is the masters. So the chosen generation, the chosen race are the masters. Whereas here in Mark, they are the children. Notice in Matthew, woman, great is your faith. In Mark, for saying that, you may go. So Jesus is magnanimous enough to accept that the woman has beaten him in Matthew. In Mark, Matthew will not allow that.